What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some first impressions for Final Fantasy XII The Zodiac Age, and I do intentionally mean the Zodiac Age specifically because I am very familiar with the original, but I have never actually played this remaster, and continuing my tradition of trying to knock out a bunch of games I've been meaning to get around to forever this year, I'm taking a look back with this one. Now, straight away, the Zodiac Age, from what I understand, removes and changes a bunch of things that were grindier in the original, which means this should theoretically be easier, and we'll get to those in just a moment. But Final Fantasy XII is in fact my favorite Final Fantasy. I enjoy its gambit system, the original license board which has been changed here even, and the admittedly very heavy focus on political drama was something I enjoyed a lot too. And yet, as much as I enjoyed the original, the changes are almost immediately apparent when you fire this up, not least of which because it starts you off by asking a few different questions, like if you want to play New Game Plus or New Game Minus. New Game Plus is probably a little bit different than you'd expect, because really what it does is allow you to start the game at a very high level, level 90 to be specific, but doesn't really carry anything else forward. New Game Minus is kind of the opposite of that, though. You actually can't gain experience at all, which means you have to complete the entire game at the default level you start at, and while that does sound difficult, it's not as bad as you might initially think because of how the game handles powering up via your license boards. In addition to those options, however, you do have some sort of built-in cheats, more or less, with the ability to maximize your license points to fill out your license boards pretty much immediately, alongside maxing out your money as well, meaning you don't have to grind for any of that stuff if you don't want to. Then there's also a speed up mechanic even, just to make animations and whatnot play even faster. So basically there's a whole ton of helper features before you even start actually playing the game to notice things like the remastered audio and whatnot. So a lot going on there. Now, one thing that did actually not exactly surprise me, but jogged my memory, let's say, was definitely the opening sequences, because people are kind of split generally on Final Fantasy XII. I think, as with basically any Final Fantasy game these days, really, people have a lot of opinions about it, but one thing I've seen is that the story definitely doesn't land for everybody, and having played through the opening again, I was immediately reminded why, because they basically throw you into first couple of hours being the thick of that political drama I mentioned, where it explains the situation between these two large powers who overtake two smaller powers in between them, or specifically the Arcadian Empire does, by using a bunch of complicated maneuvers to effectively subdue two different countries at the same time, while utilizing admittedly pretty minimal resources. But in order to explain that, they're throwing names at you, countries, concepts, etc., and it goes pretty quick. And I was like, oh, it's pretty easy to get lost here if you're not really into it. But one thing I was especially interested in personally was the changes to some of the progression systems. So I would say the big one here is the licensing board. In Final Fantasy XII, both the old and new version, in order to equip various upgrades to your equipment, you need the actual equipment, yes, but also you have to have the license to use it, which means as we defeat enemies, we get licensing points, and then you can spend those on the licenses to then equip those things. In the original version, this was all just on one really big board. In the Zodiac Age, it functions a bit differently because it is actually divided up into a different board for each of the classes or jobs that they've implemented. These taking the form of basically archetypes that then have the appropriate licenses to fulfill that archetype. Another somewhat easy to overlook change to this, though, is that they've also added a bunch of passive increases to power and stuff to support those playstyles as well. And I don't remember those in the original, which I'm pretty sure was just like equipment and the like. But speaking of equipment, one of the things Final Fantasy XII is really well known for, actually, is its kind of insane grind in order to get a couple of items in particular, but also how you could ruin your chances to get some of those items by just looting innocuous stuff in the opening areas of the game, and that stuff has also been addressed. The Zodiac Age makes it easier to get those items that people are after, like the Zodiac Spear, for instance. So even just beyond the license board changes, there's some pretty good changes to the way the itemization works as well. Though, it's probably worth a mention that Final Fantasy XII was never exactly a gigantically difficult game or anything anyway, because of the sort of change in direction on the combat side of things. Another big reason this game is one of my favorites is because it kind of utilizes a combat system that you'll often find in CRPGs, which is effectively a real-time with pause system with an elaborate AI setup. And while I can't show you the footage of it just yet because you don't unlock the actual Gambit portions until a little later in than I am currently, you're eventually able to set up like AI setups for each individual member of your party to undertake, which will then dictate how they behave in combat, and you can get very, very elaborate with. And while that's not exactly crazy today, the fact that this game did that all the way back in 2006 is pretty wild, considering that's a system most people associate with games like Dragon Age Origins in 2009. And it just so happens that this game is also, in fact, home to some of my favorite companion interactions, which is also the case for many people in Dragon Age Origins, which is why I made the comparison. But all of that stuff to really just kind of highlight that I really, really do believe that Final Fantasy XII is a game that was ahead of its time. And in some ways, I think it suffered for it, primarily due to things like small exploration areas alongside loading times that were an issue, which, obviously nowadays with this remaster aren't nearly as much of a problem, which I want to say before we wrap this video up is kind of my favorite thing about it so far. So a lot of these changes and just the advent of modern technology getting rid of a lot of the nuisances like all those loading screens, not so much by actually removing them, just making the load times so fast they're almost negligible, really does kind of make it feel like this is just a fantastic way to experience this title as somebody who loved it a great deal in the past. So putting all of that together, I'm excited to play more of this. Because of all these changes, I'm looking forward to checking out some of the stuff that I remember as being more of a nuisance in the past, like Zodiac or Yasmat, and how those have been made easier, that kind of thing. I also am curious how things like the exploration side of it will keep up, because the hunt system in-game often required you to hunt down monsters in a specific way or do specific things to trigger those fights, because as enemies are just out in the world with you, you have to get them to spawn sometimes. And I'm just curious how all of that kind of thing feels in today's day and age, despite my fond memories of it. But just a couple hours in, I'm kind of already impressed with just how much the Zodiac age changes and addresses here. But in terms of the upcoming review for this, it's going to take me a little while. I can't give it my full attention just yet, as I have a couple other things I'm working on, but once I do actually turn my full attention to it with the features and things this game does to help speed things up, I'm not exactly sure how long it'll wind up taking, especially since, regardless of those features, I actually really do plan on jumping into it and simply enjoying myself, as I really do love this game. But sooner or later, this one will have a review out, and you guys will be able to check that one out, which I am personally very excited for, at the very least. But for today, that's pretty well going to do it. Certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.